On July 15, 1984, Kari Swenson was in the middle of a 6-mile run training to compete for an upcoming biathlon. She worked at a nearby ski ranch and used her free time to get in shape for the upcoming competition. She was in the mountains in Montana, and her biggest concern was a bear that her boss had seen in the area the day before. Carrie was experienced in outdoor activities, and though she thought it would be cool to see a bear in real life, she knew to keep her distance. The other thing she needed to focus on was the trail in front of her. It was not smooth and was covered in rocks, roots, and holes. She didn't want to twist her ankle, so she made sure to keep her eyes glued to where her feet were going. Because of that, she didn't notice the 2 men standing on the side of the trail just up ahead. Once she did notice, she quickly became apprehensive about running by them. They didn't look like hikers or fishermen, and they had rifles despite it not being hunting season. She made the last-minute decision to try to turn around, but it was too late. The older of the 2 men grabbed her, and that would be the beginning of 18 hours in the hands of 2 men who wanted her to be their bride. This is Monsters. Dan Nichols was born on January 20th, 1931 in Summers, Kansas. His father, Pat Nichols, was a coal miner from West Virginia, and his mother, Margaret, a Kansas native. He had an older sister named Betty and a younger brother named Ted. When Don was only 2 years old, the family moved to a small town in Montana called Norris, and Pat started mining for gold, though he didn't seem to be successful. About 4 years after moving to Montana, Pat was driving home from a party intoxicated when he lost control of the car and crashed into a ravine. Pat was killed and the other passengers were seriously injured. Margaret remarried pretty quickly to another miner named Steve Engelman, and unlike Don's father, Steve was not interested in hunting or fishing. Not only was Don's stepfather not an outdoorsman, he disagreed with Don on every topic. People close to the family said the two argued constantly, and sometimes those arguments would turn into beatings for young Don. For a boy who already idolized his biological father, having such a tumultuous relationship with his stepfather only pushed him further into isolation. Without someone to take him into the wilderness and teach him how to survive, he started doing it on his own. He would leave and spend long periods of time out in the woods, hiking everywhere his feet would take him. He did well enough in school, but was considered a loner. After high school, Don joined the United States Navy and was stationed in Guam around the beginning of the Korean War. He wasn't in the service for long, as taking orders wasn't really in his wheelhouse. When he was discharged, he moved to West Virginia and met a woman named Berdina King. They married and eventually had a daughter named Barbara Nichols, but soon Don was longing to go back west. So they intended to move to Montana, but ended up in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. There he began working as a machinist, and eventually he and his wife had a son, Dan Nichols, who was born in the mid-60s. The exact date is unknown. Don tried to settle down and be a family man, but he never got used to it. He would work long enough to save up enough money that he could take time off and go live in the wilderness for months at a time. He would hike all over, picking berries and hunting. As the years went on, he got more and more disillusioned with normal society. He told people that it was a rotten system and that in the wilderness a man could be free. Well, that would have been fine, except that Don had a family to support, and eventually his wife got tired of his antisocial behavior and divorced him. She remarried and settled down near Bozeman, Montana, while Don started living in the mountains full-time. As Dan got older, his camping trips with his father got longer and longer. They would eventually last all summer, and in 1973, Dan's school had to file a truancy complaint because Don had never returned him when summer break ended. The local sheriff found them still camping in Bear Trap Canyon, and Don apologized, saying he didn't realize summer was over because he didn't keep any kind of man-made calendar with him. Dan went with the sheriff, but was sad to leave his father. Dawn was teaching Dan how to live a secluded life in the mountains, and Dan seemed to idolize his father just like Dawn had idolized Pat. Dan was a troublemaker in school, probably not a surprise after spending the summer with his father, who was not a role model when it came to fitting in and following the rules. Dan got into trouble for skipping school, fighting, and once he chased some girls with a knife. When he was in 11th grade, he started seeing an older divorced woman named Sue. Once he had the attention of a woman, he started spending less time with his father, which Dawn was not happy about. Eventually, Dawn got Dan to drop out of school and join him in Jackson, Wyoming, working to save money to build a cabin in the Montana wilderness. Dawn's dream was crushed when he found out that Dan had been making long-distance calls to Sue that was costing them their hard-earned money. It's unclear what happened next. The stories vary between Dawn beating Dan to Dawn making Dan swear to cut off all contact with Sue. The result was that father and son returned to the mountains in Montana in 1983, living off the land through the winter, the following spring, and into summer, where they made a plan to find a wife for Dan. Being a couple of recluses living in the woods, there weren't a lot of places they could legitimately meet women, so they resigned to the fact that they would need to kidnap one. Kari Swenson was born in 1961 in Pennsylvania to Robert and Janet Swenson. Robert became the head of the physics department at Temple University, and both Carrie and her sister Joanna were born while he was completing his PhD. After that, they lived in Belgium, where her brother Paul was born. The family was able to travel Europe in a VW bus before returning to the States, where Robert began working at Temple University. Robert loved Bozeman, so in 1970 he took a job as the head of the physics department at Montana State University, and the family moved into a cabin there. In Montana, Robert and Janet spent time with their children hiking and fishing and generally instilling a love of the outdoors. Joanna took up tennis, and both Carrie and Paul became avid cross-country skiers and competed in biathlons. The biathlon is a sport in the Winter Olympics that's often confusing for some people. It combines cross-country skiing with target shooting, and it originated in Scandinavia and was taken from early life, where people from the region would go out hunting on skis. Carrie became a member of the U.S. biathlon team and competed in the first biathlon world championships in France. There she placed 5th in the 10-kilometer final with a time of 45 minutes 49.6 seconds and having hit 14 of the 15 targets. It was a record for any American biathlete at the time. Her team placed 3rd overall at the championship, giving Americans their first international medal for the biathlon. In June of 1984, Carrie was back home and had just graduated from Montana State University with a degree in microbiology. Her plan was to go on to become a veterinarian, but before then she wanted to spend another year competing in the biathlon to best her previous record. She had a job lined up at the Lone Mountain Ranch in Big Sky, about an hour south of Bozeman. She'd be able to make some money, do some training, and spend some time with her brother, as Paul had a summer job there as well. On July 15th, Carrie was up early at the ranch, loading up Sunday brunch to serve the guests. While prepping, she chatted with the ranch manager about a large grizzly bear he had seen the day before. Carrie loved animals, obviously why she wanted to become a veterinarian, and she would love to see a grizzly in real life. She thought maybe she'd see one later that day on her run. Paul warned her to make sure she told somebody where she was going if she was going to be running alone. Carrie worked a split shift, so after breakfast she had some time to change her clothes and go out to the trail before needing to clean up and work a shift serving dinner. She drove up the mountain to the trails around Ullery's Lake and parked her car. She started with a slower jog around the lower lake to warm up and then picked up the pace going up the hill toward the upper lake after about a mile. As she completed her second mile, she listened to the sound of the creek between the lakes. It was a place where humans were the minority. Away from the resort, this area was more populated by elk, deer, moose, and bears. The creeks and lakes had been designed by the local beaver population. Though she loved the wildlife, she needed to be careful. The previous summer, a visitor had been killed by a grizzly. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be animals that Carrie would need to worry about that day. On July 10th, Dawn and Dan started hiking east over Lone Mountain. They had backpacks and rifles as well as holstered handguns. On the 14th, they made it over the peak and were near Ullery's lakes when they decided to stop and do some fishing. That day they had hidden their packs and rifles in the woods and were fishing on the shore when they spotted a young woman floating in the water. They asked what the date was and she told them, then they chatted for a few minutes before they heard a man call out. She had floated out of sight of her husband, and when she realized it, she paddled herself back out toward the middle of the lake. It would later be realized that the two men had been planning to kidnap a woman for at least a few months, so they were already hunting at that point. On the 15th, when Carrie parked her car, she noticed a man fishing, so she took the path that would take her further away from the stranger. Dan noticed her and continued watching as she rounded the other side of the lake. As Carrie hit the 3rd mile, she topped the ridge and looked down on the pristine water. She began running down the steep slope on her way back down the incline. When she was about halfway around the small lake, she noticed movement in the woods across the water. She assumed it was someone willing to make the trek for the benefit of the less populated fishing spot. Just as she passed the lake, Carrie was focusing her attention on the ground to make sure she didn't twist her ankle on a root or in a hole. When she glanced up, she was surprised to see two men standing on the side of the trail. The older man was right on the trail and the younger man was back in the woods. They looked too dirty to be fishermen, and then she noticed 2 packs and 2 rifles leaned against a tree. It was not hunting season, and her surprise turned to apprehension as she slowed to continue surveying the situation. She saw that both men had holstered pistols and knives, but there was no indication that they were intending to attack her, so she decided she would speed up and blow right past them. That was until the older man stepped onto the trail and completely blocked her way. Carrie tried to break the tension by asking for directions. She asked if she was on the Jack Creek Trail, and the older man told her he was. She thanked him and started to turn around, but the man grabbed both of her wrists. She demanded that he let her go, and when he refused, she asked what he wanted. The man responded, quote, "Well, we don't meet many beautiful women up in the mountains, and we just want to talk to you for a while." Then he added, quote, "just to carry on a conversation." Carrie told the men that she didn't want to talk to them and demanded she be released again. When she suggested they were going to rape her, the man seemed offended and claimed that wasn't their intention. When he asked her name, she didn't want to give it to him, so she blurted out, "Sue." She said she was married and gave him a fake name for her fake husband. The man asked where her wedding ring was, and Carrie explained that she worked in a kitchen and didn't wear it due to the machinery. Both men agreed that they thought she was lying. The older man asked if she had children, and Carrie answered truthfully that she did not. She begged to be let go, but the older man turned to the younger man and asked, quote, "What do you think? Should we keep her?" To which the younger man answered, quote, "Yeah, let's keep her." With that, Carrie started screaming. She called out for help, but there was no answer. When Carrie started struggling harder to get free, the man released her left wrist and hit her across the face. As she stumbled backwards, the old man put her in a headlock and told the young man to grab her wrists. He tied a rope around her right wrist and then tied the other end to his own left wrist. When they let her go, she continued fighting, and the older man threatened to blacken both of her eyes. That's when Carrie tried to appeal to the younger man. She told him that he didn't need to get involved with something like this, but he answered, quote, "No, I want to keep you." They went on to claim that they were going to hold her for 4 or 5 days, and if she still didn't like being with them, they'd let her go. She didn't believe them. Enough time had passed that the men were getting worried they were going to be spotted, so they started collecting their gear, getting ready to leave. That meant the younger man had to untie the rope from his wrist so that he could put on his pack, and Carrie used the opportunity to flee. Unfortunately, the older man was holding the rope and he yanked her back toward them. She collapsed to the ground, but the man snapped at her to get up, and she finally gave in and did as she was told. Carrie knew that there were dangers out in the Montana mountains, but at that point it was likely she would have preferred to run into that bear that her boss had told her about earlier that morning. At least with the bear, she knew where its motivations were. They got the rope tied to the young man's wrist and started hiking into the woods with the older man behind Carrie, with his rifle in her back. They were not hiking on any type of trail, and the deeper into the forest they went, the harder it would be to find her. Carrie knew that the best chance of being rescued was to slow their progress as much as possible. She started breathing heavily to feign exhaustion and then requested they stop to rest and get some water. The old man agreed, and they proceeded to take off their packs, then retie the rope to the young man's wrist. Carrie sat down, but when the older man bent down to drink some murky, stagnant water from a bog, Carrie told him that he could get sick if he drank it. She explained that there was protozoa in the water that could cause diarrhea. The man looked confused and said he had been living in the mountains for a long time and had never had a problem. Then he asked her how she knew so much about proto-whatevers. Of course, by then Carrie had a degree in microbiology, which was where her knowledge came from, but she didn't offer that detail. She just told the man about giardia, which was common in all of the water in the area. He just shrugged it off and kept drinking. Then Carrie asked how they got food, and both men told her about planting a garden, hunting, and foraging for roots and berries. The older man said they had everything they needed, they just needed a woman for company. Then he mentioned starting a clan. They were refusing to admit it would be rape, but they clearly wanted her for a very specific purpose. Carrie began protesting their plan again. She made it clear that she did not want to go with them and she would not stay with them willingly. She would not decide she liked them after a few days and choose to stay, so they might as well release her then. They declined, and after the process of getting their packs back on and securing Carrie's tether, they continued heading deeper into the wilderness. Carrie never stopped trying to get even the slightest edge against her captors. As they hiked, she complained that the rope was too tight on her wrist, and she asked the younger man if he could loosen it. He started to agree, but the older man snapped, quote, No, Dan." He explained that she would be able to wiggle free and escape. That was when Carrie first learned that the younger man's name was Dan. As they walked, she continued to step in any soft ground she could see, leaving footprints for anyone out looking for her. When she thought the old man wasn't looking, she dropped her headband, but he caught her. He warned her that if anyone found them, they would shoot them on sight. The next time they stopped for a break, Carrie was able to get her watch off and dropped it without being noticed at first, but when they were getting ready to continue their journey, the old man saw it on the ground. He warned Carrie again and put it back on her wrist. No matter how much the man threatened her, she refused to give up. After begging to be released and trying to reason with the men, Carrie knew that they would not release her willingly. So she started watching and listening so she could learn as much as she could about them. There was a similarity in their faces that made her believe they were related, so Dan was likely with his father. They talked openly around their captive, and she heard them discuss society and their anger at the increase in population in the area. They believed that the area was being ruined by people coming in and building new houses and resorts. They talked about their plans for where they would take her to not be found. She finally asked if they were related, but the older man said it was none of her business. They eventually came to a small stream, and the older man decided they would camp there for the night. Any hope that Carrie might have had that she'd be able to get out of the rope that night disappeared when the man dug into his pack and pulled out a length of chain. Dan directed Carrie to a tree where the other man wrapped the chain around her tightly and secured it with a padlock. He put one key in his pocket and handed the other to Dan. Then they set up camp, with Dan readying the area for sleep and the older man beginning to cook. While they were busy, Carrie tried to pick up a rock near her and hide it under herself, thinking maybe she could use it to break the chain or the lock. As she moved, Dan noticed and came over, moving all the rocks and sticks out of her reach. Dan dug into his pack and pulled out an old rolled-up magazine, which he gave to Carrie. When she unrolled it, she realized it was a Mad magazine, which she proceeded to thumb through. Dan went out and tried to kill a deer they had spotted not far away, and Kari used the time to try to get more information about her captors. She told the man that she was only 22, and he responded that he had hoped to find an older woman for his son. Her suspicions that they were related were confirmed. She suggested since she was too young, he should just let her go, but the father told her it was fine. He explained that she would stay with them until she decided which one of them she liked. As time went on, it became more and more clear that they had no intention of ever releasing her. The man then told her that he had bought the chain years ago with the intention of keeping a woman until she decided she wanted to stay. The father-son team had been planning this method of finding Dan a wife for years. After hearing a gunshot, a deer suddenly appeared from the bushes and raced away from them. Dan resurfaced soon after and said he only grazed the doe and it got away. After that, they ate some biscuits that the older man had cooked on an old skillet. It was burnt on the outside and soggy in the middle. While they were eating, they suddenly heard a voice in the distance. In an instant, Dan had his rifle trained on the forest in the direction the sound had come from, and the old man had put out the fire. He picked up his rifle and told Carrie that it better not be anyone looking for her because they would shoot them with no problem. Nobody ended up discovering them, and shortly after there was a plane overhead. It was a single-engine plane flying low enough that it might have been able to see them. They unchained Carrie and pulled her under the cover of the forest until the plane eventually went away. Then they chained Carrie back to the tree. The chain was around her waist as she sat on the ground with her back against the tree. Dan gave her a long-sleeved shirt and some wool socks to wear, and then the older man gave her a sleeping bag for her legs. It was pitch black out when the men decided to go to sleep. Carrie waited through the night, unsure of what the morning would bring, let alone the rest of the night. Would one of her captors get up in the middle of the night and decide it was time to have their way with her? Would they wait until morning? There was no way of knowing. Sometime during the night she heard the sound of a trail bike, but knew there was no way they would be able to make it past the thick woods that surrounded her location. Carrie was supposed to be back at work for the dinner shift at 5 p.m., so by 6 her manager had noticed her absence. When Paul arrived for dinner, she asked him if he had seen his sister, but he hadn't. That worried Paul because Carrie was responsible and not known to be a no-show at work. He suggested that her car might have gotten stuck, but he knew she would have been able to run back to the ranch with no problem. She must have hurt herself. If she had twisted her ankle, she might have not been able to make it back to her car. Someone checked at her room but reported back that neither she nor her car were there. Another employee named Jay Schreck mentioned that he had seen her car parked at Ullery's Lake earlier that day, so Paul jumped in his car and headed there. He found Carrie's car still parked at the beginning of the trails, and Jay showed up shortly after on his dirt bike. He took the bike onto the longer trail, and Paul headed down the other trail to try and find Carrie. The staff at the ranch called the Swensons and Bozeman to let them know that their daughter was missing. Like others, they assumed that she had gotten injured and was in need of rescue. A frantic situation, but the thought that Carrie had been snatched off the trail by two deranged hermits wasn't even a consideration. Robert called the sheriff and then phoned a friend who had a small plane and asked him to fly him over the area. Robert headed to the airport while Janet packed up first aid supplies and headed with a family friend to Big Sky. Robert was quickly over the Beehive Basin, circling over the lakes where Carrie had been running. When Janet arrived at the ranch, she met with the manager and he told her where the various staff were searching. By 8 p.m., the trails throughout the area were packed with family, friends, and coworkers, all yelling for Carrie and searching for shoe prints that matched her New Balance running shoes that had cleats. They would leave a distinct impression, but they weren't having any luck locating them. Once it got dark, the pilot turned the plane and headed back to the airport. Jay continued searching on his bike later into the night. While that was going on, law enforcement was slow to get involved. There were some jurisdictional issues that caused a delay in action. The manager of the Lone Mountain Ranch was used to dealing with the Gallatin County Sheriff, but Ullery's Lake was across the border in Madison County, and they had a policy against doing searches at night. It also sounds like messages for other members of law enforcement weren't getting to their intended destinations. Janet called the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department and asked them if they could help, and eventually the two agencies agreed to work together. The search was becoming too difficult in the dark, so more crew and search dogs were lined up for early in the morning. By 4 a.m., people were out in force searching for the missing woman. Dogs were on the trails and people were starting to move off the trails and into the wilds of the mountain. Two of those people were a friend of Carrie's named Alan Goldstein and one of the employees at the ranch, Jim Schwalb. They had made their way in the same direction that Carrie had been taken, and at about 7 a.m. they stumbled onto the camp that the captors had set up the night before. At dawn, the birds started squawking and woke the captors. Dan wandered into the woods to find breakfast, and the father stayed in the sleeping bag. Dan returned with a dead squirrel and told Carrie he was making squirrel and biscuits for breakfast. The old man said that Carrie's red shorts were too bright and would get them noticed, so he ordered her to take them off. She said no, but he threatened her and she gave in. She still had the sleeping bag over her bottom half, so after she took them off she wasn't exposed, but she had no idea what the plan was. While his father was off altering her shorts, Carrie begged Dan to let her go, but he responded, quote, "No, I want to keep you for myself. You're purty." Nothing she said would make him change his mind. The other man threw her shorts back at her, now darkened from fire ash, and she started pulling them back on when there was a rustling sound in the bushes. Dan jumped up and pointed his gun at a man who was crouched down by their camp. Carrie yelled out a warning, saying, quote, "Stay back, they have guns, they'll shoot you." Dan tried to shoot the rescuer, but his gun jammed. The older man aimed his rifle at him and asked if he was looking for the girl. The man was Jim Schwalb, and he said that he was. Carrie yelled out another warning, and that's when the man told his son to shut her up. By then, Dan had reloaded his gun and pointed it at Carrie as Jim came closer to her. She tried to warn him again, but there was a sudden explosion. A bullet left Dan's gun and hit Carrie in the chest, pushing her back against the tree. Dan called out to his father that he shot Carrie and said she needed help. His father told him to shut up and yelled at the two rescuers to stay out of the camp. Jim raised his hands to show that he was not armed and walked further into the camp. He asked Dan where Carrie was shot and knelt down next to her. Then he yelled out for Alan to call for help. The older man yelled out and asked if Alan was armed, and Alan responded that he was. He took cover behind a tree and aimed at Alan, but Jim jumped up and grabbed the rifle. They struggled, but the old man was able to get free and fire a round at Alan. The bullet hit him in the face and he collapsed to the ground. As Jim ran out of the area to escape the gunfire, the father ordered his son to grab their gear so they could get out of there. They took the chain and lock and the sleeping bag from Carrie, who was laying on the ground bleeding out. As they fled into the forest, the old man yelled to his son, quote, "They'll never take us alive." Carrie had been shot in the chest and the bullet had hit her lung. She was having trouble breathing, but she was hanging on as best she could. She was cold and her vision was blurry, but she could see the shape of something near her. She reached out and found a backpack, and inside was a sleeping bag. She managed to wiggle herself inside of it, but she believed that she was going to die. Jim had contacted the ranch and they got a helicopter in the air, but they had trouble finding the exact spot. Finally, hours later, rescuers made it to her and she was airlifted out of the forest. Alan Goldstein had died on the scene. Carrie was rushed to the hospital where doctors cut away her clothing that was crusted with dirt, ash, and dried blood. She had a single gunshot wound in her chest just below her right collarbone. It had punctured her right lung and exited her back below her shoulder blade. Her chest cavity was filled with blood, which had collapsed to the right lung and pushed her upper organs to the left, also putting pressure on the left lung. Though Carrie was safe, the men responsible for her abduction and the murder of Alan were still on the loose. At the camp, the sheriff of Madison County, Johnny France, collected multiple pieces of evidence, including multiple shell casings and some sharpened sticks. He did not put down any location markers, didn't fill out any evidence collection cards, and he didn't have the area taped off. Sheriff France dropped the evidence off at the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office, where it was inventoried and locked in the evidence room. The following day, a deputy who had been on the scene asked about the shell casings and sticks, but they had not been dropped off with the rest of the evidence. Between Sheriff France leaving the scene and him arriving at Gallatin County Sheriff's Office, they had disappeared. They were never found. After getting information from Carrie about the name of the younger captor and their descriptions, local authorities knew they were looking for Dawn and Dan Nichols. Carrie had spent the entire 18 hours she was with them not knowing Dawn's name, and during that time they believed her name was Sue. Over the next few months, deputies, with the help of professional trackers, did their best to locate the fugitives while Carrie recuperated from her injuries. It wasn't an easy journey. Doctors had trouble stopping internal bleeding, and eventually Carrie flew to Seattle to see if she needed more surgery. The doctors there found some blood between her lung and chest wall, but the bleeding had stopped and they determined she didn't need more surgery. In October, there was a string of robberies at some cabins up Highway 191 north of Big Sky. Most of what was stolen was food, including flour, pancake mix, shortening, canned chili, powdered milk, and frozen meat. The burglars also took a sheepskin coat, a pair of snowshoes, and a few paperback books. Then a ranger station had been rummaged through with a pair of boots stolen from there. Snow made tracking the fugitives difficult, but the thefts made the authorities sure they were still in the area. They could have fled, but they would have left the mountains they had been exploring for years, and it seemed they believed that the familiarity would help them stay undetected. In November, Carrie started training for that year's competitions, and it was a struggle. She used a TENS device, which stands for transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation, and sends electrical signals through certain nerves to relieve pain. It didn't do a lot to help and actually hindered her training at one point. One of her training days, the electrodes were too close to her right arm and it made her arm twitch while she was trying to shoot. At a doctor's appointment after Thanksgiving, the doctor told her there was still a fragment of metal from the bullet in her chest and she needed to stop training to give her body time to heal. Carrie refused. She eased off of her training a little bit, but continued so she would be in shape to compete in January. At the beginning of December, the Alan Goldstein Memorial Races were held at Lone Mountain Ranch to commemorate the sacrifice the man had made to try to rescue his friend. Dawn and Dan spent months hiding out in camps they had dug out high in the mountain wilderness. They would come down occasionally to shoot a deer for meat and then would return to their camp. But as winter hit, the animals were staying too far down the mountain for them to reach without being spotted. The provisions that they had stolen from the cabins were running out, and they weren't about to go back to the same spot. They had also learned that Carrie had not died, which meant that Dan was not a murderer. It's believed that he was more willing to put up with the cold and the hunger when he thought he was escaping a murder charge, but knowing he had not killed anybody made the thought of continuing to suffer less bearable. Dan became less and less cooperative, and he and his father started getting into fights, verbal and physical. The bond they had once had, which was strengthened by their shared guilt of murder, was fractured and they started becoming careless. They eventually decided to leave the secluded area they were in and head for a lower area where there would be more deer and rabbits to survive off of. They planned to cross the Madison River and head west toward the town of Harrison. They could build a hidden camp in the flats and be more comfortable during the winter. They weren't known in Harrison, so Dan could cut his hair and shave and go to a store in town to grab some staple supplies with the $25 in cash they had on them. They hiked down toward the river and waited until there was a gap in cars to cross the bridge over the river at Highway 84. They headed up the mountain to the west of the highway and dug in a camp to wait out the snowstorm they had been hiking through. On December 13th, Roland Moore was out making sure the water for his cattle wasn't frozen over when he spotted some smoke rising from the nearby mountains. He was friends with Sheriff Johnny France and knew all about the manhunt for Don and Dan Nichols. Roland went back into his house and called the sheriff's station, but Sheriff France was out of the office, so Roland explained what he saw and then got in his truck to go check it out. He drove along the highway underneath where he had seen the smoke, but didn't see any parked cars or tracks. That told him the smoke was not from your usual campers or coyote hunters. He crossed back over the bridge and parked at a nearby general store where he could see the side of the mountain above the highway. Through his binoculars, he panned across the hill until he saw a man standing on the ledge, staring right back at him through his own pair of binoculars. Suddenly, the man ran off and a second man could be seen stepping into view. Roland sped home and called the sheriff's station again, but the sheriff was still not in. They contacted the deputy on duty who was eating lunch and relayed the information. Then the FBI in Butte was contacted and a plan to get a helicopter in the air was formed. It didn't take long for two crews of deputies to make their way to the side of the hill where the Nicholses were seen. When Sheriff France made it to the scene, he was notified that the helicopter was delayed and it was on a different job. When they found the tracks left by the fugitives during their hasty retreat, and as word that the chopper was still delayed, France made the decision to head into the mountains on foot. An officer from the Gallatin National Forest had shown up with an Arctic Cat snow machine. Sheriff France took the snowmobile up the mountain in order to scout the area as other officers ran to higher positions in an effort to cover him. Sheriff France was able to follow the tracks until he hit a fence and then continued on foot. He radioed to have other deputies take a Bronco up the West Ridge to try to get a vantage point from that side. A small plane was overhead searching for tracks and trying to help direct France. After what seemed like miles, the sheriff finally came upon a new camp that Don and Dan had built beneath a snowy overhang. It seems they believed they wouldn't be able to be spotted there, and that was true for the plane, but not for someone on foot. France didn't have a great way to take down the two men and remain covered. If he used his radio, they would definitely hear him. He made the rash decision to jump into their camp and said, quote, "You guys spot any coyotes?" Don went for his rifle, and Sheriff chose not to shoot him when Dan got in the way. Instead, he dove behind cover and yelled out to Don. He told him not to do anything stupid and to give Dan a chance. Dan wasn't in too deep and could have a life. He told the father that this was not the place that his son needed to die. By then, the helicopter had arrived and was circling, adding to the noise made by the plane making passes. Don asked how many men were with the sheriff. He lied and said 2 more. Don asked what he should do. Sheriff France said he should put his gun down and come out into the open. Defeated, finally Don and Dan dropped their weapons and raised their hands. The survivalist fugitives were finally captured. The helicopter found a place to land and 2 other officers joined the sheriff in placing the Nicholses under arrest. It was about then that Don realized that he had been tricked and they had been captured by a single person. Once in custody, Don tried to ease his bruised ego by claiming he could have killed Sheriff France at any time. The only reason he didn't was because he knew the law would hunt him down and kill him and Dan. He claimed he would have done it if he had been alone. Sure. The men were tried separately, with Dan's trial being first in May of 1985. Dan was charged with kidnapping and misdemeanor assault. He claimed that shooting Carrie was an accident, but Carrie testified that she heard Don yell, quote, "Shut her up," and Dan immediately turned and shot her. According to her, it was not an accident. He was found guilty on both charges, and Carrie gave a moving impact statement. Dan Nichols was sentenced to 10 years and 6 months in prison, and he was deemed a dangerous person for the purposes of parole. Don's trial started in September of 1985, and he was charged with kidnapping, murder, and aggravated assault. Don took the stand and testified in his own defense. His lawyer had him detail his entire life, from his childhood to his marriage to his failed attempt to homestead in the mountains near the beginning of his marriage. He described himself as a social person who wanted to have his own quote-unquote tribe. He claimed he wanted it to be, quote, something like an Indian tribe. But in reality, he was very antisocial and wanted more of a cult. He wanted to grab at least one, maybe more unwilling women and force them to birth offspring to create his own little mountain clan. That was backed up by the rest of his testimony, which was a rambling bunch of nonsense that most people couldn't follow. He admitted that he had not seen Carrie get shot and was unclear about when he picked his rifle up or if he pointed it at Jim. He did admit to shooting Alan. He said, quote, "I just pulled my gun around and shot him." He confirmed that he offered no aid to Carrie after she was shot, and when he was asked why he left her there, his answer was, quote, "Well, we couldn't take her with us. I mean, obviously." Yeah, obviously. During cross-examination, the prosecutor had him confirm that he had restrained Carrie, but Don didn't like where things were going. Don told the prosecutor that it wasn't like how he was making it sound. Don claimed it wasn't kidnapping. It wasn't sinister. Don was so disconnected from normal society that he genuinely didn't understand that forcing a woman to live with them until she gave in and agreed to stay was still kidnapping. When the prosecutor tried to confirm that he had caused the death of Alan Goldstein, Don started rambling about it not being that simple. He was part of the equation, but Alan could have also caused his own death. Don had no problem finding bizarre reasons to not take responsibility for his own actions. That did not help him in the long run, as the jury likely saw him as a remorseless monster who had no issues with the lives he had destroyed. There wasn't really anything for the jury to think about. There was no question that Don had committed the crimes he was charged with, and his own testimony didn't contradict that in any way. The jury were given options for what they could find Don guilty of. When they reached a verdict, they found him guilty of kidnapping as opposed to unlawful restraint. They also found him guilty of aggravated assault as opposed to just assault. And of course, they found him guilty of deliberate homicide. Dan Nichols was sentenced to 85 years in prison. Dan was released on parole in 1991 and stayed out of trouble until 2011 when he was arrested on drug charges and sentenced to 4 years in prison. It's been reported that he lives near Great Falls and has stayed out of the spotlight. Dan was denied parole 4 times before finally having it granted in 2017 after he had served 32 years. He was 85 years old at the time and died on June 17, 2023. After her attackers were sentenced, Carrie put all of her focus on training and was given a spot on the U.S. biathlon team. She competed in the 1986 biathlon in Oslo, Norway, where she came in 4th place. She retired from the sport after that and enrolled at Colorado State University Veterinary School. She eventually set up a practice in Bozeman. She suffered from nightmares for years after the kidnapping, and we can only hope that she was able to find some peace after Dawn and Dan were locked away. Hopefully more so now that Dawn is dead. Dan seems less inclined to commit a kidnapping without his father's influence, but it can't be easy knowing he's out there, living in the same state. Just because a person survives an encounter with a monster doesn't mean that it doesn't affect them for the rest of their lives. Hopefully her story has been able to bring some inspiration to other young adults who may be struggling with trauma. Thanks for watching This Is Monsters. New episodes are uploaded twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. There are occasional bonus episodes covering unsolved cases and criminal history. If you have a suggestion for a case you think I should cover, leave it in the comments. You can always follow the channel on Instagram at thisis_monsters and purchase merch at thisismonsters.com. Thanks so much, and be safe.